morning.
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 I want to continue discussing the intersection of the arts and in our practice, our Zen practice, in Buddhism. Last time I talked, a few weeks ago, it was painting, which I'm pretty familiar with. This time I'd like to touch on literature, in particular poetry. I have some interesting connections to it, other than trying to be a poet myself, but one of them is one of my Dharma brothers, teaches poetry and literature at, I can't remember, one of the Michigan universities. He lives in Ludington, Michigan. His name is John Wolfe, Gendo Wolfe, and he and I go all the way back to the early days of practice with Myoyu, even before she got transmission from Mezumi. And so John and I have been pretty tight Dharma brothers over the years. He wrote a book about, I think it came out in 2016. It's called The Driftwood Shrine. And the title actually refers to, let's see if I can find it here. Let's see, here we are. Henry David Thoreau received a royal gift of 44 books on Eastern religions from his English friend, Thomas Cholmondeley. They were exceptionally rare books which Thoreau cherished for the rest of his life. Thoreau shared the news of their arrival as one might, he said, share the news of the birth of a child. He then proceeded to shelve these treasures in a bookcase that he made out of driftwood from the Concord River, an act by which, as the biographer Franklin Sanborn put it, Thoreau had given Oriental wisdom an Occidental shrine. That is a kind of entrance into this. I want to reconnect to the way I started my talk last time. Was talking about Dogen Zenji's Ginjo Koan, and the one phrase in there about self in particular. Koan actually found this, she says, out of a 3-foot stack tall of papers. Just happened to reach in and pull it out. She didn't know where it was, and there it was. So I read it and I felt compelled to read it because it just connects directly with what I was talking about, except that it goes to poetry in a way that I hadn't considered before. It is by Zoket's Norman Fisher, who is a poet, and also a Zen practitioner, of course, and he has been many things, but basically he was born in 1946 and in Pennsylvania, studied in Iowa. At one point I think he was abbot of Green Gulch, and I assume, I don't know his history at this point, but I think he's an abbot somewhere. Am I right? So,
In California, somewhere.
yeah, okay. All right. Zen Master Dogen wrote a well-known text called Ginjo Koan, which I translate as the koan of the present moment. In this text, he kindly extends the notion of koan, or fundamental meditation object, to our simple being within the present moment of our lives. A classical koan presents us with an insoluble problem. The only way to extend ourselves into that problem completely is to stop trying to solve it. In other words, to stop trying to make something of it and simply to allow it to fully be what it is, which would necessarily mean that we would take it so personally that it would be our life. In Ginjo Koan, Dogen points out that we do not need to take on some old saying of the masters in order to confront directly the issue at hand. In fact, each moment of our lives, if we would let go of our definitions and protections and elisions and lean fully into it, begs the question, what is to be done? What is this moment after all? Here is the passage from the Ginjo Koan. Of course, to study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be confirmed by all things. This confirmation is the dropping off of body and mind and oneself and all others. It is enlightenment that dissolves all its traces, and the tracelessness goes on endlessly. He goes on to say, to study Buddhism is to study the self. This means that one looks deeply and honestly at all points at the way in which one's life actually unfolds, looks, enters, and allows. This is always interesting, always provides a path forward, no matter what it is that arises. That anything arises at all is always a miracle enough, whether we like it or not, whether we like it or no. So there is no judgment or resistance necessary. And even where there is judgment or resistance, there is a settling into that with appreciation and awe. To study the self is to forget the self. Means that once you practice in that way, your definitions and hedges against yourself fall away. And you can be perfectly happy going on with life, simply life, without any need to make anything out of it. To forget the self is to be confirmed by all things. Allowing things to be as they are without any protection is to appreciate the materials at hand in everyday living, as in art making, which may not be so different after all from everyday living. There is a sense of form and presence in each and everything that comes forward in the present moment. Dropping off body and mind of self and others is harder to see, for it expresses the freedom that one would feel in the renunciation of everything, being willing to live as one is right now, without any need to hold on to life now or in the future, and to see that everything shares in this already. Finally, enlightenment dissolves its traces, and the tracelessness goes on endlessly. This sense of life as anything distinctive dissolves. It doesn't look like anything. There is the sense that in the useless and unmade space and time of actual living, there is a subtle endlessness and namelessness that is delightfully available to everyone at all times. So Ketz goes on to say, I take this vision of Dogen to be more or less descriptive also of the process of making art. Of anyway, the sense of art making that I am advancing here, which is, after all, following Ginsberg and Valery, an inherently religious one. I do not want to conflate art and religion, of course. I recognize that they are not the same thing, and yet I'm arguing that what we call the aesthetic impulse is at bottom identical to what we call the religious impulse. Certainly, the cultural history of Zen, particularly in Japan, could attest to the close relationship between the two activities. There are so many directions I could have gone with this, and I guess I felt I had to go as personal as possible. I'm attracted to haiku. I've always been. They kind of spontaneously jump out at me when I'm taking walks sometimes, and I enjoy the pure simplicity and the immediacy of them. and it talks to as much to my Zen practice as anything. So what I thought I'd do is to start out a little bit by, I dug in to find out the history, kind of where the Japanese poetry comes from, and in particular where haiku comes from. In the poetry of Japan, the earliest of the Japanese lyric poetry, the Kojiki, or the record of ancient matters. This is from about 712 AD, so it predates Dogen some, how many years is that? 500 years? Yes. Mostly it's free form, talks about the beauty of nature, love and longing, loyalty to a sovereign. And then later there was, in the 8th century, the first anthology, the Man-yoshu, collection of myriad words. Again, it's about beauty of nature, love and parting, grief and sorrow, over the transience of things. That eventually gave way to courtly poetry, something that was more given to the leisure class of that time. A lot of artifice, wit, subtle wordplay. Basically, all that outweighed the strong emotional themes. The poems in the Manyoshi, there were two primary forms, still around today. The tanka is the short form, 5-7-5, 7-7, so it's 31 syllables of those 5 lines, 5 first, 7 second, 5 third, 7 and 7. So the other is the choka, or long form. It's the same structure, but it's of indefinite length. These were from, I think in particular, around the Heian period. I think it was, there's a fairly good description of this sort of activity happening in the Tale of Genji, if you're interested, by Lady, what is her name? Murasaki? It was popular within the nobility. They held competitions in the emperor's court. It was basically for nobles. And then that was kind of how things were going until about the 16th century. Nearly all Japanese was in the tanka form, as I described before. Developing from the tanka was the renga, which still used the tanka form, but it had 2 parts to it. And these 2 units, going again with the 5-7-5, 7-7, they would divide it up into the top part being the introduction, the 5-7-5, which eventually became the haiku. I don't know how to describe that, but it was something that was grabbed onto by monks, priests. One in particular was Matsuo Basho. He was one of the first in the middle of the 16th century. It tended to be a little less rigorous, less formal. And as I said, it was very immediate to the moment. And I think that was something, and it's still something that attracts me. Taking that into mind, and what I just read there, Norman Fisher alluded to Ginsberg and Valéry. There are a surprising amount of American poets that are connected to Buddhism or find their roots in Buddhism. There are well, people like Norman Fisher, Gary Snyder, W.S. Merwin. All of these people, I have been attracted to their poetry since I really got interested in literature. Of course, it goes back to the Beats, Jack Kerouac, and Ginsberg. Later, of course, some of these folks writing poetry actually became Zen priests. Peter Matthiessen, Philip Whalen. I hear some of them talk about it. They say it's almost like it's not a choice. It's just what you do, just like this practice. Gary Snyder, on writing about his practice, Zen practice, and poetry practice, wrote, "Meditation looks inward, poetry holds forth, but in practice it is never entirely clear which is doing which." And then back to haiku. I felt I had to bring up at least one, and probably the most famous one, which is Basho's The Old Pond. Old pond. Frog jumps in, water sound. I think there's several versions of this that have been translated. Some of them actually have the automatopoeic version where they just say splash. W.S. Merwin, writing on haiku in his foreword, and a foreword on Robert Aitken's book on Basho's haiku. It's the dynamic in the manner of a single frame of thought, an instant that is unique, indivisible, and therefore whole. So the moment of the haiku could be said not to move, but to be totally movement. I'm kind of loosely tying all this together here. And at the same time, trying to reorganize my thoughts around this. Zen, as with poetry, it is the investigation of the self beyond the self, seeking beyond seeking. One comes to that, not knowing which is most intimate. When one's mind is empty, it can be filled with the present. So, as poetry, at its best, it is a moment performed in one's being. My Dharma brother Gendo, one of his first talks before he did ordination with Myoyo was on William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow. I love his poem. It is so sparse yet so evocative. I'll just read it. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. I think what's amazing about this poem, it leaves so much for whoever's absorbing it. I'm a guy that uses wheelbarrows a lot, so at the beginning of the description, the discussion about it, he talks about what exactly depends on a red wheelbarrow. The faster your common sense disappears in a haze of uncertainty, that experience changes into the nature of the question. Penetrating deeper into it, you may notice yourself asking something simpler, something more direct, like, what is the red wheelbarrow? There's so many places where poetry pops up in this practice. I was Gendo's second for his Shuso ceremony, and it was at the end of a 7-day practice period in the summer at Miyoshinji. That 7-day practice period is all we can manage, not a 3-day ongo, so this is what we call our ongo. And there's always somebody who is Shuso. And Gendo is learned, erudite, always throwing stuff he knows at you, but he also has a wonderful sense of humor. At the end of our particular tradition up there at Miyoshinji of being Shuso, you go around the room and instead of offering congratulatory comments, you offer a poem. So most of us spent an hour or two just putting something together. Now, Miyoshinji is in Wisconsin. It's in a portion of the Great Plains. It's in farmland. It's beautiful up there. It's just rolling hills. One of the things I'd started to do was give my congratulatory poem a place, and just as a form that I could pull out each time somebody did Shuso. Give it a place, relate to the weather, relate to the person as much as I could. I believe what I said at Gendo's Shuso was summer here on the Great Plains. He's giving words of levity and wit. Cool rain on bald heads. Now, poems for the poet, doing his best work. That so describes that whole time, and some of what's not there is that one of the first people that did Shuso with Myoyu had recently had a breakdown, and he couldn't be with us. But he managed to send in his own poem from the hospital. It was kind of an interesting thing. So he did and was able to re-engage with us. One of the things that Gendo talks about in the Driftwood Shrine if you yearn for a spiritual authenticity and originality in an age of reckless and irresponsible speech, you need only look at the poems that have been growing like weeds in our own backyard for nearly 2 centuries. The Dharma gleams in these poems in both subtle and profound ways. He wrote that October 2016, right before the election, and all that was happening within the media, all that insanity. Easy to appreciate for that time. Gendo also advocates for reading poetry aloud. I mean, it's easy to sit around and do this. I think when I'm home, I can belt them out best I can, but about reading a poem aloud. It is hard to explain and impossible to overemphasize that the brilliance of a poem jewel is never fully appreciated until it is polished by the living breath. It isn't hard to do this if you read aloud with the feeling you will never do it again. Unless you are willing to let go of all the caked-on makeup of the self, a poem read aloud will not leave your mouth sounding like a poem, and some part of its meaning will be lost. Years ago when I was in school here, I was a painter. I had just been through a grueling critique, and I wanted to go home and self-medicate, so I did. So I was sitting in front of my fireplace in the late evening, and I'd had a couple of glasses of wine in me, and I was pretty wired from the day. And I sat down, and for the first time I picked up something other than schoolwork or some kind of art book, some kind of painting to look at or something like that. And I picked up Eliot's 4 quartets and just got completely absorbed in them. I was up probably until 3 or 4 in the morning reading them, and some of them I read 2 or 3 times. What I found out was that, and what the 4 quartets did for me, were a kind of sweeping of my mind, because it was impossible to get so absorbed in them and not escape what I'd been through the day. They became profound, but also in the same way they talked about painting to me. Meaning in the way that I look at painting is that it is kind of an act of poetry already. It is so fluid that good painting offers you numerous ways in and numerous ways out, and numerous ways to re-enter. I found that the 4 quartets were doing that for me on that particular night. And ever since then, when I need to kind of shift, I'll go back to the 4 quartets. I want to finish on a poem, maybe a couple here. Since I started with Norman Fisher, I'd like to read one of his poems. Poetry's a way, not a subject. Poetry's a way, not a subject, in which anything appears. It's a sway among a swarm, to be hurled from side to side, up against the language walls, the tunnel subversive, through what is as far as it is known, occasioning a gap in the mind through which you could theoretically drive a truck. Meanwhile, dogs bark, canaries tweet, monkeys propend opposable thumbs. The covering sky won't shake out its stars to cooperate with the head's coolness. The disaster that is human life on earth, that this can be said, that the imagination blisters in the cauterized night, is possible only in the reams of paper. These hidden significant blotches of ink we twiddle in the dark. I know my fate rests with the splendor of diamonds. They cannot be seen in the dark. I'd like to read one more. This is Diane de Prima, one of my favorite poets. Death Shunyata chant, a rite for passing over. This is based on something she was inspired by from Sogyal Rinpoche. Starting out with, everything is illusion, but I am confident that all is well. That was said by Sogyal Rinpoche. If there is a pure land, we release the spirit, send it flying into the Buddha's heart. Everything is illusion. If there are angels, will they carry you, singing, into the presence? I am confident. If the flesh is light and the fire is a lover, if the ashes are scattered at sea, on the wind, or planted in the earth, if all the 5 elements are wisdom dakinis, and I am confident that all is well. What is shape, size, glaze? Will you take in the potter's hands? What realm emerge in? If the paths of the bardo are glorious or frightening, if the light and sound is deafening, overwhelming, everything is illusion. If there is only extinction and total dark, if we cycle through forms throughout the galaxy, if we must know return to Sirius, continue our evolution, I am confident that all is well. If you will be judged by a bureaucratic God, or wear golden shoes in the golden fields of the Lord, or carry to death your guilt about kinky sex, if the faces you hallucinate are a last judgment, everything is illusion. The bodhisattvas, adepts, the magic teachers, lotus paradises, pearl gates, and all the realms of Satan, the name of confusion and the name of wisdom, both blown away on the wind, the night of Brahma lasts 1,000 aeons. The worlds are born and die 60 times a second. Valhalla and the sky of the ghost dancers, the spiral journeys under other stars, and shift and fade, flicker and reemerge. They are all an ancestral dream time. Do you see? The black air that rattles in the back of your throat is transparent, a window on an unspeakable dance. Vortex of Isis, Shiva, Hayagriva, Olokun. The ambrosia of Kali is just this bitter taste, bile in the back of the tongue. Awareness focuses as the vision fades. Everything is illusion, but I am confident that all is well. Any questions, comments?
So you've given us lots of examples today of various kinds of Dharma expression through poetry, and I'm wondering from your own experience and from your own practice, what you think it is about the poetic form that makes it so effective as a means of Dharma expression? Because there's lots of literary form. I mean, it could be short story, it could be news writing, it could be, we use words in lots of ways. So what do you think it is about poetry that makes it such a useful, powerful expression of the Dharma?
A lot of us are really good talkers, and a lot of us can talk a lot.
He's looking at me.
Don't say.
I think what we do, and the problem with language is it's such a slippery, difficult, dangerous thing, and we use it cavalierly, and there are times I know that when I'm trying to be serious, it just doesn't come off serious. And the opposite happens. I'm trying to be funny and it comes off as serious, or it insults somebody. I think the thing I love about poetry, and especially the kinds of poetry that I'm attracted to, is it takes away, through profound ambiguity, it takes away the ambiguity. It is the closest thing to words actually being Dharma. My practice is with koans, originally with Myoyu. And I use a lot of words, use a kind of poetry, really. And I see the connection with going into the Doksan room and sitting knee to knee with my teacher, and having to be as authentic as I can be, and think about sitting up here and how do I authentically put across what this is and what it means to me, and how I think it, how I really believe it is an expression, a true and authentic kind of expression, in the same way that painting is. So, given the difficulties of language, this is language closest to authenticity and not being language. It's the point where, as if you remember my last talk, it's the point where I can leave the room and the poem stands by itself.
So for those of us that want to do some practice with this, do you have some suggestions about reading poetry as practice, or writing poetry as practice, or somehow engaging with poetry in some way as practice? It would be easy to simply read the poem and say, that's nice, and put it back on the shelf, right?
Right.
So how can we work with this form in our own practice?
I don't know. I can just tell you what I do personally. I've been lucky, actually. I have good friends who are poets. My wife is a poet. I have been lucky enough to be around people that teach it, aren't afraid to do it at the drop of a hat. So, as far as places to go, I mean, I scour bookstores. I found this as a wisdom anthology of North American Buddhist poetry. I love old bookstores, and I'll go to the poetry section after I go to the Dharma section or something like that, you know. So, pick something up, start thumbing through it. And if something talks to you, you know, I think really my earliest initiation into really wanting to engage poetry was with the Four Quartets. And it kind of came out of a really difficult time and a difficult day. I think, like what I said at the beginning there, it's something that you can't not do. Sort of like the almost 30 years I've been doing sitting and doing this practice, you know, I can't feel like, this feels like something I can't not do now. And poetry's kind of the same thing. So, I think the answer to your question was in there somewhere.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned fear. That you're around people, you've been fortunate enough to practice with people who do poetry without fear at the drop of a hat.
Right.
Do you see fear in people who want to approach this sometimes in their practice? Maybe we think we have to be experts?
Yes,
something?
yes. Well, I know I do. I know. I'm afraid to give my own poetry out there. I don't want to look like a fool or to sound like an idiot. You know, of course, then I go back to my old teacher and doing koan practice in front of her, and one of her comments was, after I sat in front of her and tried to answer or respond to a koan, was, "Teacher, I feel like a fool." And she said, "Maybe you're not enough of a fool." So,
Thank you. Let somebody else have a chance.
yes, sir.
So you talked about so many fond memories because I knew Philip Whalen in person, and I know Norman in person very well.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things. Several years ago, I attended this 1 week session format, but it's basically haiku workshop, and I won the award. It was really interesting because towards the end, you share everybody's haiku. You kind of toss in what you think your best was. And then each one of them is recited twice in Japanese style because haiku always has to be recited twice. And then people basically vote by doing this. And I got the Grand Prix. And the person who was leading the session was quite interested because I'm a non-English speaker. I started as a non-English speaker. And the previous year, the person who won the Grand Prix was someone from Poland. And she also doesn't speak, her English is much worse than mine. And I actually honestly can't even, I still can't count the syllable in English well. So there's something about the spontaneity and ambiguity, you use those words, and there's something in there that's very interesting. And I remember I have also, Norman is a Zen teacher, but also he still functions as a poet. And he gives performance, like beatnik performance. And he once told the audience that the reason why he's so interested in poem is exactly the same thing. Hosshin's talk always touches that element of how you have to keep on describing, utilizing words and concepts to describe something that is beyond words and concepts.
Mm-hmm.
You have to keep trying. And Norman is really exploring that portion. And he says poetry is probably the only form, most possibly the only form of writing that is not even expected to articulate. So therefore, it's more embracing. So therefore, spontaneity, ambiguity actually expresses better.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was very interesting.
Yes.
And another thing is, in his performance, like poetry recitation, is very interesting because it also not just incorporates beatnik style, but something like a Lenga style.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, there are 3 poets and kind of combat-like poetry. I don't know if this is choreographed. It's probably spontaneity. And sometimes it starts to sounds like a singing, almost like reminds you biker. And so it was very interesting. And of course it's a long tradition from Gautama Buddha to Dogen to even Hojo-san's interested in waka. So
yeah.
it's very close to our heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
So I've been a lover of poetry for many decades. And I think actually it may have been poetry that brought me to Zen practice. And specifically reading Kenneth Rexroth's poetry. And you didn't mention him, so I just wanted to put in a plug for him.
He's in the queue.
Yeah, oh, okay. So, this was someone who was aligned with the beat poets and lived in Japan and did a lot of translation, though I don't know that he knew Japanese, probably worked closely with other people. And also for quartets, which you mentioned a lot, is really dear to my heart. And so one thing that's important to me is the fact that I've been reading the same poems for many decades. And you spoke about that too, that you return again and again to four quartets. And to me, that is related to what Isan brought up about the ambiguity of poetry. Because if all poetry did was clearly give information, then I'm not sure we would feel the need to return over and over to the same poems. I'm just curious if that's also your experience, that when you return to these beloved poems, you might be noticing something different, on different occasions.
Well,
And
I'm sorry.
no, please.
I think that is the one thing that's kind of difficult to grasp about poetry is that, in the same way I think of good painting, is that it changes form with you. Of course, the painting or the poem does not change. You
Right.
change.
Well, I'm not sure that's all we need to say. And this is talking about, I'm trying to talk about what Hoko brought up. What's special about poetry as opposed to other forms of writing or speaking? And so it seems to me that it has ambiguity built in. There was something you said that sounded as if it's very direct, it's very clear, and I wanted to protest a little bit. That's what I'm trying to do now. It has a directness, yes, but it also lets people interpret. I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
We have to bring a lot of our own, I'm not sure what the right word is. I wanted to say our own self to it. And as you said, our self is always changing. And so maybe that's why we return over and over. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
I'm trying hard, but I feel like I'm failing.
It's like whatever we do, we approach with the mind that we have in the moment. The four quartets look different to me now
Then back then.
than they did.
Yes.
I had unusual experience a couple of years ago of encountering a painting I'd done when I was a student at IU, and thinking, actually, for a moment, wondering who did that.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of a delightful thing to find out that, I kind of
It
like
was
it.
mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
It speaks to me. Yeah.
So, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a little bit hard to talk about poems directly. What Gendo does here, he takes a dozen poems and breaks them down in his own ideas and own thoughts. I look at them, they do something different for me.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean
Yeah.
he's wrong about it.
Right.
It's just, yeah.
Right. But I think that's the attractiveness, the beauty of it too.
Mhm. Thank you. And I have another thing I wanted to ask you. And that has to do with zazen and poetry. And there's, when I think of those two things together, there's a sort of almost like a conflict. And that's because in zazen, not always, unfortunately, but sometimes, for myself, I have a kind of wordless state that arrives, where my internal chatterbox finally quiets down. And especially during session, when there are many days of not talking, not reading, not writing, I think that's more likely to occur. And so that is, to me, the really special, one of the really special things about practice, not the only thing. And so it's a bit odd to me that poetry would be somehow an expression of practice. I'm not disputing that it is, but anyway, do you have any
Can I
reaction to that?
respond with a haiku?
Please.
This momentlessness comes to pool at these eyebrows, not the least ripple.
Not the least
Ripple.
ripple. Ah,
This momentlessness comes to pool at these eyebrows, not the least ripple.
thank you.
Don't you?
I think one of the things that I sort of struggle with generally as a Zen practitioner is elements of it seem kind of elitist, and it's hard to get people on board who aren't like well-educated, mostly white people. And poetry, you know, is of course a big part of the tradition, but I think it's also kind of pretty heavily intertwined with that elitism. You know, like Buddhism has for most of its history been something that's, you know, at least the way that we understand its history through the eyes of wealthy, well-educated people. So I was just kind of wondering, you know, what you think about that. I mean, I love poetry also, but it seems like maybe for certain segments of society, it's not maybe something that would speak to them. So I'm just kind of curious what you think about that.
Wow. I think poetry happens without people knowing it too. All people. I lived for several years over in Owen County, which is one of the poorest counties in Indiana. It's a beautiful county. One of my neighbors is an auctioneer. He's also a preacher. And he's a huge personality and not easy to get along with. But he's the kind of guy that I can admire because he is authentically himself. So he can see you across the crowd while in the middle of a spew of the auctioneer's language, and just turn and look at you and say, "Hey, Michael, how you doing?" And then just go right back onto it, you know. And how do you capture that? I mean, that's one part of it, you know. And I think you can see that kind of beauty, and that's the poetry too. And that's maybe where the elite breaks down. The polish is not there, but the beauty's there. Thank you. Yes.
I was looking for something else when I found that piece by Norman Fisher, but I grabbed it only because I took a moment to read the newsletter that Hoko sent, and that's how I knew the topic. However, I'm trying to write my piece for the book that was just published about Watch Your Bodhisattva practice as I was laboring and realizing it was not possible. What came out of that, the synthesis of all of these pages, was a haiku. I did not have the courage to take 21 pieces of paper and write one word on each and send it in. That being said, I'm going to the opposite extreme, because you said you're a painter, and a painter is beyond words. A picture is worth, I believe in China it started with X number of words and we've reduced it here. So that would be anyone of any race, religion, creed, socioeconomic class, can look at it and give whatever words or not. So I'm curious that you started with poetry, but you're a painter, and that's quiet and silent and beyond words. So I'm just curious that I love poetry too, but I couldn't paint anything because I don't have that right brain skill. But I'm curious, what is it with painting that appeals to you? Because you first said you were a painter. And I'm assuming it's not painting the walls. Excuse me. I'm assuming it's not that.
Right. I think ever since first grade, I've been a painter or an artist. I gave some of my history with my first Shuso talk last couple of weeks ago. Talked about how when I was a kid, somehow it just came out that I could draw and paint and do that kind of thing. And so I was always the guy in school that people would send their projects to or do the posters or whatever. So I haven't thought of myself any other way, really. Poetry came later. And it probably solidified with that incident I talked about, sitting and reading the 4 quartets late at night. I draw a perfect line between painting and poetry. In a way, I can't separate the two. They do the same kind of functionally in a different format. But it's also said by some people that every painter, every artist paints the same painting their whole life. It's one great big painting, but it's the same thing. So I don't paint these days. It's something I think about a lot. I think about how my work is often like painting. It's sort of how I think about how one lives their life. They're doing their work or their kind of work all the time. It's sort of like I find myself so many times doing something. Something breaks, somebody has something breaks, they hand it to me, and I think I can fix it sometimes. Sometimes I can't. And it's just automatic. It's sort of like I cannot not do that. And I cannot not make something. And these days I cannot not do poetry, or at least do it in my head, or at least see it somewhere, or at least read it. It's the shape that this fellow's life is become. So it's Zen, and it's all that painting and all that poetry and all that family and all that mess. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, yeah, but it's just, so if I understood your answer, there's one essence that has two different forms of expression, and depending upon your condition. And you started out as a painter as a youth, but as you matured, you're now in poetry mode?
I guess I'm
Yeah,
just saying it's really hard to draw a distinction.
okay.
They mean the same thing to me. They perform the same way. They live in my head the same way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
After reading the four quartets, and also perhaps after your Zen practice deepened, it seems inevitable that your paintings would change. And so I'm wondering if they did and how so.
Well, it's kind of easy to say. I started out as a figurative artist. I started a series of baseball cards. There was a baseball card store in Bloomington, down on the square. And I decided to go in there one day because I was interested in the iconic imagery that baseball cards provide. There's a head or a body, a figure, there's a background, there's stats, there's a border. You know, it could be decorative, but it also can do some really interesting things. So I went through every single card in the store, and some of the historic ones. I found 2 cards that I really liked. And to look at them, they're just baseball cards. And then I thought about how hard they would be to paint. I painted them full size. So the size of a door. The interesting thing is they grew into something as I began to paint them. One of them had a very interesting background, but I couldn't tell what was going on in the background. So they're basically photographs. The backgrounds are blurred. Believe it or not, it's hard to paint blurry. So the more I looked at it, things started to emerge. Gandhi was there. Elvis was there. You know, these things started to pop in. So that added an extra thing to me. And also, it's just, if you know me, I could give a crap about paint or about sports. I like to play sports, but I don't watch sports. I sort of developed an interest in baseball because of the baseball card thing. And so I could go to a friend's house and we could watch the World Series, and then I could kind of see the beauty of it and what's happening. But I needed an interpreter. I needed somebody there to kind of tell me what was going on. So for me, it was a completely objective experience looking at what a baseball card is as art, or it becomes art. And then developing my own thing out of it. Now, that's the figurative side. At a certain point, maybe sometime after the 4 quartets, I can't really put my finger on it, I became much more figurative, or abstract. I was attracted to the German Expressionists and then the abstract Expressionists, and I started to paint. The only way I can relate it to is somewhere between, if you know who these people are, Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein. And very gestural, and they began to do exactly that thing we've been talking about, where the abstraction can go in different places, can do different things at different times. It's all like how you approach it, how you come to it with your mind. Wherever you're at, that's where the painting, that's the point you can take off with the painting. So, thank you. Yes, sir?
If this is a series, are you going to talk about music and dance next?
Those are probably the two things I know the least about. But I'll try. At some point I'll try. I'm thinking architecture's next.
Okay.
So we'll see. Yes.
I wanted to go back to what Doju brought up about different types of people coming to poetry or coming to practice. And it occurred to me that hip-hop, rap, freestyling, that's poetry. And it's not usually done by white people or well-educated people, really developed by African Americans in the inner city and continuing that tradition through many decades.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how that can be related to Zen practice. Somehow I don't think many of them are interested in Buddhism. But anyway.
I could relate it to Zen practice.
Oh, you could? Oh, that's great.
The utter spontaneity.
Yes, that's true.
With Myoyu and doing koan practice, spontaneity, something that was so authentically coming from you, an engagement that was authentically coming from you.
Mm-hmm.
So I could see it happening the same way.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Thank you.
Sorry. May I just comment on that very briefly?
Mm-hmm.
I went to a poetry reading a few months ago in New York City, and then I met a few people from other Zen centers coincidentally.
Mm-hmm.
And these people asked me, so who do you think is the best, most interesting contemporary poet to you? So I said, it's Kanye West and Kendrick Lamar.
Pardon?
Kendrick Lamar.
Uh-huh.
Seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a Zen practitioner, and they said, we agree. So.
Yes.
I think for me the most interesting or important element is your mentioning authenticity. As an artist and an art educator, that's what I tell my students, because that makes you most vulnerable, but that's what makes you also your best in terms of connecting to other beings, connecting to your primordial self. We have to transcend this realm so we can go back to our primordial self. And I feel like religion art helps us do that. And visual and audio art is often ineffable. It expresses the ineffable, those we cannot put into words. Poetry is a little tricky because it tries to do that, but with words. So it bridges the two worlds, but sometimes it becomes an obstacle, and sometimes it does the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom is a poet, so I grew up with her. And my creative process is very much shaped by being with her. And I realized recently that even when I'm writing articles for a magazine, it's often about art. My process is the same. I am approaching writing like I'm making a sculpture. So I do understand when you're talking about the function is the same for you, whether it's poetry or whether it's painting. It's coming from the same place and it does the same thing. And I also just want to mention that as far as we know, before we had words, we had pictures. So everyone has that ability. So you can do it. So I encourage everyone to try doing that, because we have that in us. We are not perhaps created equal in terms of, from the Buddhist perspective perhaps, but we all have equally all the resources we need. That's what I believe. So, that's all.
Thank you. Do we need to wrap it up?